Hi again, welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we looked at how Denmark established colonies in Greenland and in India in the 1600s. The colonies in India lasted for many generations and boosted the Danish economy that experienced something of a golden age in the 1700s. Greenland still remains a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, even though the cash flow is reversed these days. Sweden also gave colonialism a go by setting up New Sweden along the Delaware River. But that project never really got off the ground before the Dutch snuffed out the Swedish dream of a colonial empire from Newfoundland in the north to Florida in the south. Today, we'll focus on another and more sinister aspect of Scandinavian colonialism, namely Danish and Swedish participation in the Atlantic slave trade. Episode 108, Scandinavian Slave Trade. The Atlantic slave trade was the dark side of the blooming Scandinavian commerce in the 1700s. The system worked as a triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The Danes and the Swedes didn't invent it, but they joined in during the late 1600s. Very briefly, it worked like this. Manufactured goods from Europe were sold in West Africa in exchange for slaves. These slaves were then brought to the Americas. The slaves who survived the horrible voyage across the Atlantic were sold to plantation owners and forced to work the fields, producing valuable crops, such as sugar. The sugar was then brought to Europe, where it was sold at great profit. Some of that profit would pay for more manufactured goods that were shipped to Africa to start another round of this deadly but highly profitable carousel. The Swedes were the first Scandinavians to gain a foothold in Africa. In 1650, they purchased a trading post called Cabo Corso on what was then called the Gold Coast. Today, it's a part of the modern-day country of Ghana. The Swedes only owned the colony for 11 years, and just like New Sweden, it was taken over by the Dutch, who later lost it to the English. The Danes arrived at the Gold Coast more or less at the same time as the Swedes were booted out. It was Christian IV, the very same king who sent those first expeditions to Greenland and India that we talked about last time, who wanted to establish a Danish presence in Africa. It took them a few years, but in 1661 they gained permanent control over a port in Africa, which they called Fort Christiansborg. This trading port became the center of the African leg of the Danish involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. Here, Danish merchants sold goods, not least firearms, brought from Copenhagen and bought slaves who were then shipped to the West Indies. By the early 1700s, the Danes were well established in the slave trade. By then, the Danish West India Company operated both Fort Christiansborg and a number of other trading posts in West Africa. To begin with, the Danes at Fort Christiansborg bought slaves brought to them by sellers belonging to the Aquamo people. The Aquamo were feared in the region because of their habit of capturing conquered tribes, taking their women as concubines, and selling their men as slaves to various Europeans, such as the Danes. Needless to say, the Aquamo were not only feared, but also hated by many other tribes, and in the 1720s, the neighboring tribes united to take their revenge. In a dramatic reversal of fates, the Aquamo were defeated, and from 1730, they were the ones being sold to the Danes at Fort Christiansborg. Once the slaves arrived in the West Indies, they were sold and forced to work on plantations on the island. The major crops were sugar, coffee, and tobacco, not because they were needed in the local economy or to feed the local population, but because they were most profitable crops to sell back home in Denmark. Of these, sugar was the most important by far. The white gold, as it was sometimes called, wasn't only sold on the Danish market at a hefty profit, but it was also traded with other countries for commodities that were needed in Denmark, such as rice and cotton. But the sugar didn't produce itself. Lots of manual labor was required. Working the fields on the sugar plantations was backbreaking labor, and the mortality rate was extremely high among the slaves, who often died from malnutrition, disease, or exhaustion. The food rations were usually small, even too small to provide the required amount of daily calories. So a steady stream of new forced labor was required. At the height of the Danish slave trade, roughly 3,000 African slaves were brought across the Atlantic annually on Danish ships alone, and Denmark was a small player in the slave trade. Despite the high mortality rate, slaves soon outnumbered Europeans in all Danish islands in the West Indies, and not by a small margin either. For example, on St. Thomas, the first island the Danes acquired, there were 317 Europeans and 422 slaves in 1688. By 1715, the European population had grown to 547, but the slave population had exploded to 3,042, a ratio of more than 5 to 1. 40 years later, the slaves outnumbered the Europeans 12 to 1, and the numbers were similar on all the Danish West Indian islands. To begin with, the driving force behind both the slave trade and the running of the West Indian colonies was the Danish West Indian Company. On the Danish islands, the laws and regulations were based on the laws in Denmark itself, but the local government had the right to change them whenever it was needed to fit local conditions. One central piece of legislation that was absent from Danish law was that concerning slavery. Since slavery didn't exist in Denmark, there were no laws regulating the phenomenon. To begin with, slaves were therefore treated like all other property from a legal perspective. But in 1733, we can see the first differentiation between human property and inanimate objects and animals. But it wasn't necessarily to the benefit of the slaves, because the 1733 regulations stated that slaves, unlike other property, had a will of their own and could therefore be punished for disobedience or other unwanted behavior. In 1754, the Danish West Indian islands were taken over by the Crown and were no longer to be run by the Danish West India Company. That meant that the company lost its monopoly on the trade with the islands, and now all Danish subjects could trade in the Danish colonies if they wanted to. The following year, King Frederick V issued new regulations that were meant to improve the lives of the slave population in the Danish colonies. Slave owners were no longer allowed to separate slaves from their children, and slaves were given the right to medical care when they were sick or elderly, if they lived long enough to become elderly. That was a small step forward, but unfortunately it remained largely theoretical, because the colonial authorities still had the right to adapt laws and regulations to fit life on the islands, and, shockingly, the slave owners didn't implement the king's new rules because they felt it would be too much of a financial burden on them. But which islands are we talking about here? There were 3 major islands that made up the Danish West Indies. The island I already mentioned, St. Thomas, was the first one. This particular island shows up in European records for the first time in 1493, when Christopher Columbus sighted it during his second voyage to the New World. Columbus didn't pay much attention, though, and when the Danes annexed St. Thomas in 1671, the 83 square kilometer large island was still uninhabited. By the way, if you wonder how much 83 square kilometers is, it's slightly smaller than Manhattan, which is 87 square kilometers. Anyway, it was important that the island was uninhabited because a couple of years earlier, the Danes had concluded a commercial treaty with Britain, where the British promised to let the Danes settle islands in the West Indies on the condition that they were uninhabited. In 1671, the Danish West India Company was formally chartered, and a merchant called Jørgen Iversen Dippel, who had experience from the region, was made the first governor of St. Thomas. The plan was to grow sugar and tobacco on the island, and to provide a workforce. King Christian V gave the company 2 ships and filled them with convicts from Danish prisons, who would set up a colony instead of spending time behind bars. It may have sounded like a sweet deal when it was offered to you in your damp and drafty Danish prison cell, but in reality, settling St. Thomas was no walk in the park. Of the 190 Danes that set sail for the West Indies, 77 died already during the crossing, and another 75 died during the first year on the island. Since 9 people also escaped along the way, only 29 people were left to keep the colony going. The Danish West India Company soon realized that the convicts who survived were also terrible workers, and so they decided to switch business models and started to use slaves from Africa instead of Danes. They believed that Africans were better suited for this kind of work, which I assume means that they were less uncomfortable seeing Africans dying than Danes. The second possession that the Danes incorporated into their modest but expanding West Indian Empire was the island of St. John, or Sankt Jan in Danish. St. John was even smaller than St. Thomas. With 49 square kilometers, it wasn't even half as large as St. Thomas. In 1675, Governor Iversen claimed St. John for Denmark. This time, the Brits weren't having it though, and they disputed the Danish claim. It took over 40 years to settle the issue, and only in 1718 did the Danish West India Company officially annex St. John. By now, the use of African slave labor was firmly established, and as soon as the Danish colony was set up on St. John, a first shipment of 150 slaves were brought over from Fort Christiansborg on the Gold Coast. A large number of the slaves brought here belonged to the Aquamo people. The fact that they were Aquamo plays a key role in what was to follow. Remember that they had been the rulers of the land where the Danes had established their African colonies. They had subjugated their neighbors and sold them into slavery to European colonists on the Gold Coast, but then the tables turned and they were defeated by their neighbors, and it was now Aquamo people who were shipped off to the West Indies to work on the plantations. The Aquamo certainly hadn't forgotten. They hadn't altered their proud and martial character either into something more docile just because they'd been defeated and enslaved. They had no plans on accepting their new station in life, especially not the many Aquamo notables and leaders who had been sold as slaves to weaken their people back home in Africa. By 1733, the Aquamo slaves on St. John decided that they'd had enough of forced labor and humiliation. They rose up against their Danish masters. The rebellion started with open acts of defiance at plantations close to the town of Coral Bay on the western side of the island on November 23, 1733. About an hour later, other slaves were let into the fort at Coral Bay on the pretext of delivering wood. The guards weren't suspicious since this was a routine event, but this particular evening would turn out to be anything but routine. When they were inside the fort, the slaves took out knives that they'd hidden in their load of wood and fanned out to kill the soldiers in the fort. Almost all of the soldiers were killed, but one man managed to escape and could reach St. Thomas, where he alerted the Danish authorities to what was going on. When the fort was in the hands of the rebels, they fired one of the cannons. This was a signal to let the slaves on the plantations in the Coral Bay area know that the revolt was underway and that they should take control over their plantations. A small group of rebels stayed at the fort and the rest spread out over the island. As the rebels moved along the northern coast of St. John, from plantation to plantation, they killed all the Europeans they could lay their hands on. But they didn't pillage or otherwise destroy the plantations. The reason for that was that they had a plan. They didn't want to set the world on fire and let everything burn, themselves included. This wasn't even a revolt against slavery per se. No, they intended to take control of the island and then continue with the crop cultivation. They did not, however, plan to do any of the work themselves. Instead, they would force the non-Aquamo Africans on St. John to remain slaves, but now working for their new Aquamo masters instead of the Danes. All in all, some 150 Aquamo slaves participated in the revolt, but many of the slaves on St. John who belonged to other African tribes chose to stay out of it. Some even remained loyal to their Danish owners, since they feared the Aquamo more than the Danes. When the rebels reached the Cinnamon Bay plantation, about 6.5 kilometers east of Coral Bay along the northern coast, a group of slaves joined their owners' attempt to stave off the attack. Thanks to this resistance, the Europeans had time to escape the mayhem by boat. The slaves who had helped them also managed to slip away before the rebels took over the plantation. The same happened at another plantation further west, and also there the Europeans managed to escape by boat to St. Thomas, some 10 kilometers to the east across the Pillsbury Sound. The Danish authorities on St. Thomas quickly concluded that they would need assistance to put out the revolt, and sent a request to the French on the island of Martinique. The French were more than happy to help and sent 2 ships with several hundred soldiers. But it took them a while to organize and get going, so the Aquamo rebels were the undisputed masters of St. John for almost 5 months. The French troops reached the island on April 23rd, 1734, and once they'd managed to land, the end was only a question of time. It took them about a month, but by May 27th, the numerical advantage and superior firepower of the French troops had made sure that the revolt was crushed, and St. John was back in Danish hands. Or at least mostly back in Danish hands. It took the local militia another 3 months to capture the last rebels and declare the St. John slave revolt officially over. But by August 1734, things were back to normal on St. John, at least for most people on the island. A handful of loyal slaves were rewarded for their loyalty during the revolt. For instance, a certain slave with the rather European-sounding name Franz Clausen was freed as a thanks for helping his owners escape to St. Thomas. As an additional sign of gratitude, he was later given land of his own on the island, making him the first land-owning former slave on St. John. There was land available because several of the Danish plantation owners who survived the revolt chose to leave St. John for good. They opted to settle on another nearby island that Denmark had purchased from France the same year that the revolt broke out. In August 1734, 4 ships sailed to this new island, rumored to be even richer than the one they'd left. They just had to clear all the jungle first. Or rather, they'd have to make their slaves clear all the jungle first. This new island was called St. Croix. It was 2.5 times the size of St. Thomas and much better suited for agriculture. This meant that it soon became the most lucrative of the 3 Danish West Indian islands, and the king decided that the administrative center of the colonies should be relocated here from St. Thomas. The wealth stemmed mostly from the cultivation of sugar, but also cotton, exotic hardwoods, and the production of rum. This also meant that St. Croix had the largest slave population of all 3 islands. At its peak, there were 26,500 slaves on St. Croix, outnumbering the Europeans by more than 20 to 1. The Swedes also had a West Indian colony, although their efforts weren't as successful as the Danish ones. The Swedes were also late to arrive, because they only established a foothold in the area in 1784, when they acquired the island of Saint-Barthélemy from the French in exchange for French trading rights in Gothenburg. The island, today widely known as St. Bart's, was small, even compared to the modestly sized Danish islands, only about 20 square kilometers, less than a quarter of the Danish island of St. Thomas. The island didn't just lack space, there were also few freshwater sources, and it wasn't easy to eke out much from the poor soil covering the minuscule island. The fact that you would never be able to practice any form of profitable agriculture was probably a big reason why the French were willing to part with the island. But the Swedes weren't complete idiots. They also understood that St. Bart's wouldn't make a profit from sugar or tobacco, and they didn't care because they planned on becoming a trading empire and not going into agriculture at all. Their plan was for St. Bart's to become a regional trading hub. On March 7th, 1784, the French officially handed over the island to the Swedes. At the time, there were approximately 750 people living on the island. 281 of them were slaves. Most people in the countryside spoke French, but English was also used in the settlements. There was an excellent natural harbour on the west coast of the island, and there the Swedes founded a new town called Gustavia in honor of the King of Sweden. Even after the Swedes took over, French remained the main language in the countryside and English in the urban areas, even in Gustavia. Only a handful of Swedish merchants and administrators actually spoke Swedish. Acting on the Swedish plan for the colony, the king declared that St. Bart's would be a neutral trading zone, and in 1786 the Swedish West Indian Company was established. Even though foreign ships were allowed to trade freely, the company received a monopoly on the trade between Sweden and the West Indies and North America, as well as the rights to administer St. Bart. Still, the crown was represented by a governor. The Swedes were lucky in terms of the timing of their colonization project. During the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the neutral port of St. Bart's saw booming trade. During the War of 1812 between the United Kingdom and the United States, 20% of the US total exports passed through St. Bart's. The island did not, however, become a central part of the Atlantic slave trade and the triangular trade with Europe. That wasn't because the Swedes were nicer or more humane than the Danes. Slave trade was legal and regulated on St. Bart's, and, as I've already mentioned, there were hundreds of slaves on the island. During the years that Sweden controlled St. Bart's, we know of 1,283 slaves who arrived on the island, but the lion's share of them were brought there on foreign ships. We only know of 10 voyages with Swedish ships bringing slaves to the West Indies. The truth is that the Swedes wanted to get a piece of the very lucrative slave trade, but they failed partly due to the fact that Sweden hadn't been able to establish a permanent colony in the West Africa. Despite the failure to make serious money from human trafficking, the times were good for St. Bart's, and the good times were reflected in the population growth on the island. In the early 1800s, there were approximately 6,000 inhabitants. Of those, about 5,000 people lived in Gustavia, but less than 4% of them were actually Swedish. French and English still dominated the island. Around that time, the Swedish crown took over the administration of the island, which, of course, included the large incomes from taxes and customs fees. In 1812, St. Bart's changed hands once again, when it was turned over from the crown to the king personally. That meant that all the incomes from the island now went into the monarch's own pockets, and not into the state coffers. In the first years, this was a brilliant deal for the king, who made millions from St. Bart's. But nothing lasts forever. After a few years, St. Bart's lost more and more of the trade that it had enjoyed in generations before, and from 1830 onward, it no longer provided a surplus at all. Instead, the king was forced to contribute from his own funds to keep the colony afloat. In an attempt to diversify, the governor tried to grow grapes, but it failed due to the poor access to water. One of the few crops that could be cultivated on St. Bart's turned out to be yams, but that wasn't worth it. They could certainly not be sold to the European markets for a profit. The king eventually lost his patience and handed the colony back to the state, and from 1845 the annual contributions to keep the colony going had to be paid by the taxpayers instead. Even though the government wasn't paying personally for the upkeep of St. Bart's, they didn't see the point in clinging to a money pit in the West Indies, so they decided to sell the island. Even though the Swedes tried to entice both the Americans and the Italians, in the end it was the French that bought the island back in 1877, after 93 years of Swedish rule. The Franco-Swedish agreement stipulated that the purchase had to be put to a referendum among the population of St. Bart's. It was held in August 1877, and 351 people voted for a French takeover. Only one single vote was cast in favor of continued Swedish rule. On March 16, 1878, St. Bart's was officially handed back to France. By that time, the Danish colonial holdings in the West Indies were also singing on the last verse. Already in the 1830s, the plantations on the Danish islands had started to experience problems. First of all, their most profitable product, the sugar they produced from sugar canes, had dropped in value after the Europeans had started to produce sugar domestically from sugar beets. Secondly, the British banned slavery in their West Indian colonies in 1833. When they did, slaves in the Danish colonies started to escape to freedom on the British islands. But worst of all, from the perspective of the plantation owners, was that the Danish government itself considered following the British example and banned slavery also in the Danish West Indies. Even the Danish governor of the islands was in favor of the abolition of slavery, possibly influenced not only by the Brits but also by his mistress, who was a freedwoman. The Swedes were also discussing abolition, and at the Riksdag in 1844 and 1845, when the crown took back St. Bart's from the king, it was also decided to end slavery in the Swedish West Indian colony. A committee was set up to handle the practicalities, and they ended up buying the freedom of all the 523 slaves on St. Bart's for 119,765 thaler. On October 9, 1847, Sweden went ahead and declared slavery illegal. That same year, the King of Denmark, who was still the absolute monarch and therefore conveniently made up the laws as he saw fit, finally decided to abolish slavery in the Danish West Indies as well. Just like the Swedish Riksdag, he was aware of the financial damage this would cause to the slave owners, so he went for a gradual approach. From now on, any child born to an enslaved woman would automatically be free from birth, and all remaining slaves would be set free 12 years later. That, the king thought, should give the plantation owners enough time to adjust to the new post-slavery society. He was mighty pleased with his solution, but that sentiment wasn't shared by anyone in the colonies, neither the slaves nor their owners. Understandably, the slaves weren't willing to wait 12 years to be set free, so on July 2nd, 1848, the year of revolutions back in Europe, a new slave rebellion started in the Danish West Indies, this time on the island of St. Croix. But unlike the violent revolt that had erupted on St. John over a century earlier, this one was mostly peaceful. In fact, it was more of a strike than a rebellion. Hundreds of slaves gathered outside Fort Frederick, declaring that they refused to work anymore and demanding to be set free immediately. More and more slaves joined, and by mid-morning the following day, some 8,000 slaves had shown up. The Danes holed up in the fort debated what to do. In the end, they came to the conclusion that they really only had one viable option. And that same afternoon, the governor emerged from the beleaguered fort and declared that, effective immediately, slavery was abolished. The rebellion petered out as soon as the news spread across the islands. But just because the rebellion ended as peacefully as it had started, that didn't mean that the Danish authorities were going to let the leader get off scot-free. He was jailed and set off into exile in Trinidad. The governor actually got into a bit of trouble too. Legally, he never had the authority to end slavery, so he was recalled to Copenhagen to stand trial. To begin with, he was denied his pension, but in the end he managed to convince the court and the king that he had acted in the only possible way to avoid massacres and a complete loss of control, so he was cleared of all charges. The Danish West India Company didn't fare as well though. When slavery was abolished, their whole business model collapsed, and within a few years the company went bankrupt. The plantation owners also found themselves in financial trouble all of a sudden. They demanded compensation along the lines of what the Swedish authorities had provided, and in the end the Danish crown paid the former owners $50 for each slave that they had set free. For the former slaves, it was obviously a great improvement to no longer be considered someone else's property, but materially their lives changed very little. In theory, they were now free to do whatever they wanted, live wherever they wanted, and work wherever they wanted. But in reality, the only option many of them had was to continue working on the same plantations, but now as employees instead of slaves. That meant they did get a salary for their work, that's true, but it wasn't much. And the work was still the same backbreaking labor it had always been. And now the plantation owners no longer had to provide them with food, shelter, or basic health care. This led to growing resentment among the former slaves. It simmered for a few years, and eventually it erupted into protests again. On October 1st, 1878, a new revolt started on St. Croix, where the laborers of the plantations protested against the slave-like conditions they were still living under. This revolt, called the Fireburn Uprising, was led by a woman called Mary Letitia Thomas, nowadays also known as the Queen Mary of St. Croix. The protesters started to throw stones at the Danish soldiers, who responded by opening fire and locking themselves up in the fort. When the protesters were unable to force their way into the fort, they turned their anger at the town instead, pillaging and burning. It took a fortnight for the authorities to regain control, and in the meantime the protesters caused damage costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to repair. 60 of the protesters were killed, as were 2 Danish soldiers. 12 protesters were also executed for their actions, and they were hanged already on October 5th, while the rioting was still going on. Queen Mary was eventually sent to jail, as were several other leaders of the revolt. Following the Fireburn Uprising, the Danish authorities agreed to some improvements of the working conditions on the plantations, and they also allowed freed former slaves to buy land and form labor unions. Once slavery was banned, there was really no point in holding on to any colonies on the West African coast, so the Danes sold Fort Christiansborg on the Gold Coast to Britain in 1850. The Brits didn't really want it either, and only accepted to buy the fort for a symbolic sum to keep the French out. Next in line to go were the islands in the West Indies. The question was brought up to discussion for the first time in 1852, and the Danes soon decided that the best thing to do would be to find a buyer. The US government expressed interest already in the 1860s, and an agreement was even reached with Copenhagen in 1867. But in the end, the US Senate never ratified the treaty and nothing came of it. But the American urgency to take over the Danish possessions in the West Indies increased during World War I, when the German Empire explored the possibility to take over them and establish a naval base there. A naval base that might threaten the strategically vital Panama Canal. Now Congress sprang into action, and in 1917, Denmark finally managed to sell the islands to the United States for $25 million, approximately $614 million today. The Americans took over the islands on April 1st, 1917, and renamed them the United States Virgin Islands. And that was more or less the end of Scandinavian overseas colonial projects. Next time, we'll look at a similar topic, namely the settlement of northern Scandinavia, the encounter with and treatment of the Sami population living there. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not share your opinions about it with others? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.